When you're doing community outreach, what you're doing is you're organizing your community. And the thing to know about organizing is relationships. So when you're wondering about how to find people, how to bring them in, how to figure out how to make things work, what you're actually looking at doing is creating relationships with various people in your community. It might be creating relationships with parents, finding ways to meet parents, so on and so forth. It might be finding ways of creating relationships with community organizations. It might be finding ways of creating relationships with individuals that you meet going door to door, if that's the kind of activity you think might be useful. So keep that in mind as we're going through all of this. One thing that we're going to touch on later in the exercise is that it's really important to know who all the stakeholders are. It's very easy to get focused on the stakeholders that you interact with the most, but it's really important to keep in mind everybody else who's also around, who has a stake, who has a say, who is affected by things, and know their relationships. And the last thing I want to say is, like, I had less time this time around than I was expecting to have, so I've had to cut down a little bit on what I was planning on covering today. Based on conversations I've had earlier today, I think a lot of people are looking for help with the political aspect of things rather than the mechanics of doing outreach, but as you mentioned, that's also a problem. So I'm going to put that to second, but I'm not going to promise that I'll get to all of that today. And if you're having trouble with actually figuring out how to do outreach in a good way, come talk to me afterwards and we can figure something out. So that being said, I'm going to try to do a really quick overview. Yeah, we're already quite in. So why do community outreach? These are probably things you already know. I'm just making sure we're on the same page. You do it for the community is one reason. To reach out to populations who don't make full use of the library services, to inform them of the existence of services, to provide them with access to the services, and to learn from them about services that they might need that you can then make for them, okay? You can also do it for the library. So you can build an active community of supporters, sometimes through Friends of the Library groups, sometimes through other groups, where when you are faced with a challenge as a library, they will come out and support you. You can do it to build appreciation of the value of the library among populations who traditionally have little interaction. So when millages or other kinds of things are being passed, if a large component of your population has no interaction with the library, it's going to be very hard for them to see value in supporting it unless they have some kind of pre-principle that libraries are good even if they never go to them. And unfortunately, that's not very many people. So just reaching out to people so that more people actually understand the kinds of services the library offers and why it should be funded is useful in and of itself. And then to foster the use of the library that will help keep important metrics, visitor numbers, collection use, etc., high enough to justify funding. Different libraries work differently, but a lot of libraries have particular metrics that either they are asked to use or that they find useful to use in order to have numbers to support whatever arguments they're making in City Hall or at the school board or wherever they're making their argument. A lot of us understand the value of this. I think most people's libraries these days are faced with budget cuts and threats. But what I think a lot of librarians want to do this kind of work, but we're not really taught how to do it strategically. So that's kind of what I'm hoping this particular seminar will help communicate. And I think it's really important to keep in mind, you're not doing community outreach for your own ego. You're doing it for the benefit of your community. Now, this is fortunately something that most librarians naturally do anyway. We tend to be patron-focused as a field, but sometimes community outreach can come across as being patronizing or even worse in certain communities when you have librarians reaching out. And so I put these 3 bullet points in to be basically, they say the same thing, but I think it's worth repeating. The community of people that you're reaching out to are the experts, right? They're the experts in their own lives, they're the experts in what they need, they're the experts in what services are going to be useful. Your job is to learn from them. Your job is not to go out and help them, right? And when you see opportunities, that's when you can go in and say, hey, would this be useful? Is this interesting? Is this, something that might be useful? And, then listen. So one of the key strategies when you're trying to have an organizing conversation is ask lots of questions and let the other person you're talk 80% of the time. So it's the 80-20% rule. You should talk 20% of the time, the person you're talking to should talk 80% of the time. That both teaches you about what's going on and gives the person you're talking to a sense that they're being heard, that they have control over the conversation, that they're contributing to what's going on. So, but wait, isn't this just relevant to public libraries? Well, no. I don't know that in this room we really need to go over this, but basically public schools are supported by usually local taxes as well, by millages, by decisions at the school board, and the value of the library is determined within that system often, as in what should we be spending money on. Getting parents or other community members to support the library can make a big difference in those decisions. And public universities are also, though less these days, heavily dependent on government funding. And traditional ideas of public universities was that there are three components to their work: research, teaching, and service. And in the kind of evolution, especially of Research 1 universities and the kind of attention and funding that they get, a lot of universities have been pushed to discard the service component, sometimes almost completely, often just with a kind of like, it's there in the grant because it has to be kind of like, we'll pay lip service, we'll pay somebody maybe part-time to do service, and then we've satisfied our grant requirement. Whereas, 30 years ago, a lot of universities were actively engaged in communities. For example, University of Illinois was engaged in communities around the state. The library school had a plane that they would fly to different communities in order to offer library classes for librarians all across the state, so that nobody had to travel to Urbana-Champaign. Now maybe that's not feasible anymore, but the idea is that people from the university were physically present in the communities and people saw them there, which meant that people saw where their tax dollars were going, so that they would put pressure on their legislators to actually support the university when it came up to votes in the legislature. And those kinds of connections, I can't emphasize enough how important that is, because that's where a lot of decisions that are made that, enable or disable what you're trying to do in your institution. These are reference links. So here's some examples of campaigns. Here's some examples of Friends of the Library organizations, and they vary greatly from being purely fundraising organizations to being completely independent, basically citizen lobby groups for libraries to do certain things. So there's a lot of variety there. My sense is that the more citizen control, the more kind of legitimacy they're perceived to have, which can be important. And then some examples of community outreach. These are just meant to be kind of things that people do, not necessarily a complete list, nor necessarily I'm going to say that, oh, I recommend every single one of these. I think it's just interesting to look at the different things that people are doing. And then, if you're wondering what you can do, I have a friend who worked in a mid-sized public library, and this is a library in a place where they were constantly facing budget cuts because they were one of the largest line items on the city budget. So every time somebody was talking about balancing the budget, the library came up. It was the first thing that came up in every single city council meeting. And the library was constantly in a scramble to keep up use stats and stuff like that. So he was looking at this problem, and he realized that a lot of the databases they had for car parts were databases that mechanics were using, and they were paying a fair amount of money to. So what he did is he just spent a couple hours after work to go to all the mechanics in town. And he visited every single, auto body shop, everything, told them about the library resources, showed them how they could use their library card to log in and get the same exact databases that they had in their shops. And basically, he created a population that previously a lot of these mechanics had very little interaction with the library, or if they did, it was mostly they were taking their kids to the library, right? They weren't understanding the library as a place where they could find resources, or even resources for their activities. And it proved to be very popular. And this is an example of something that you could use to then convert, because some of these local business owners are part of a group of businessmen that actually are very involved in politics in the city, who then have influence over how the city council meetings work, right? So if you have this group of people who suddenly sees that the library is a benefit to their own work, to their own institutions, they start influencing some of the other groups that actually are having power in the city and can change how the dynamics, how the conversations happen at meetings that previously librarians wouldn't necessarily have access to, or at least not in the same way. So, real quick, the problems that we're trying to deal with are really problems around power. And there are easier problems that can be solved through better communication, negotiation, mediation, talking out differences, people just talking past each other. Those aren't the problems that we're trying to deal with today. It's always good to start there, right? Start by having conversations. But sometimes you have just a complete power disparity, where certain individuals have more power than others, and it allows them to ignore the people who they have more power over. So for example, a city council that's making decisions about how libraries should work, most of the people, if not all of the city council, have very little to no experience with libraries. They think they have an idea of what libraries should be doing. There's this kind of mythos that if you run a business, then you know everything about every kind of organization ever, and therefore your opinions have more weight because your business is big and brings in a lot of money. And that's just not true. But because they have power, because they're connected to the city council, because they have money to spend, so on and so forth, they are able to ignore people who have expertise, the librarians, the patrons, so on and so forth, in their decision making about this. So understanding it's not necessarily intentional. Sometimes it is. So one of the examples up here is the Troy, Michigan example is a case where there was, in this case, a Tea Party-led crusade to destroy the library. Basically, they wanted to eliminate all funding for the public library. So there was an active hostile attack against the library. And they were able to turn it around through a social media campaign where basically somebody created a fake Twitter or something account and started talking about how it would be great to burn all the books in the library when the library disappeared. And that got people angry and then changed the conversation. But often it's the people who have the power don't necessarily understand that they don't have all the answers and that they don't understand what's going on. And so sometimes you can address this through kind of roundabout means by working to create groups of community members who have influence with the people who they will listen to when they won't listen to you as a librarian, right? Because there's always people who they care about, whose opinions they care about, who they're accountable to, so on and so forth. And so understanding those dynamics is important. Sometimes it's a control conflict. This is often the case within libraries. So it can come either, sometimes it's a case where a person just has a compulsion for control and therefore is not amenable to debate. So in the example that I told you above of my friend who went to the mechanics, that actually turned out poorly for him because even though he used his own time after not getting permission to talk to the mechanics, the person who was his immediate supervisor was very upset that he had gone and done this work that had reflected well in the library because she hadn't authorized it or told him to do it. And he ended up getting fired for other reasons, but it was because of that ruined relationship. So that was a case where it didn't work out so well. Another case is when people are simply used to having a certain control over a certain amount of things, and they don't realize that they are asserting their control over other things. So it's not necessarily, I need to have all the control, it's just this is how things have always been done, so we need to keep doing things in this particular way. And because I have the power to make these decisions, I'm going to make sure it's always done this way until, you know, I retire, in which case I don't care because I'm not there anymore, right? So, and then the most important one is when there's a clash of values. So this is often the case, so let's go back to the city council example. What is often happening is that one group is putting forth a particular value, such as literacy in the community, and a different group is putting forth a different value, for example, lower taxes. And the clash of the values becomes usually, well, not usually, but often there's agreement that both perspectives have merit, where the disagreement is over which one's more important, right? And so understanding that this clash of values exists, and understanding that you're not going to be able to talk something out with somebody who has a fundamentally different perspective and worldview over how things ought to work, right? There are some times when you can make an argument and say, look, if your values are this and the same as mine, then because this will have this effect, then we will be able to accomplish this. But if they don't agree with you on the kind of basic values of what's important to the community and where the community's priorities should be happening, you are not going to be able to have a conversation with them. Instead, what you need is leverage. And so what you need is a bunch of other people who are coming in with the same values that you have, who are influencing the process in order to make it work in a productive way differently. Okay? So, so the way you address political problems is to identify decision makers, identify the relationships, and then figure out the leverage that you have, which can influence it. So that leverage can be, you know, donors, it can be voters, it can be parents, it can be, you know, find the things that they actually care about, or find the ways that they are accountable, or find the people who they depend on, or find out how they get put in the positions that they get put in and change who gets put in those positions, right? These are all different ways of having leverage over how decisions are being made. And so you want to know who the players are, who their relationships are, and what the process is. And then, as non-administrators, we basically have, well, there's more probably, but there's three main ways that a lot of people have leverage. One, proper channels. So you speak out in a meeting, you write a petition to your boss, you know, like you create an idea. Like basically you work within the institution to try to make something work. When that works, that's great, right? It doesn't always work. Mass mobilization is one of the ways in which you can harness community outreach, is to get a group of people who have a similar idea, who are in a particular position, and then they can influence what's going on. And then personal relationships, which is really a part of the other two. But if you are able to have an honest, frank conversation with somebody who's in power as their friend or as a colleague, outside of the, let's say, city hall meetings or administration meetings or wherever, you have a different way of approaching them and a different way of understanding who they are, what makes them tick, and a different way of getting them to listen to you, where even if you don't agree, you can get them to act differently in certain circumstances than if they see themselves as diametrically opposed to you. So, let's see. Yeah, and solutions don't need to be head-on conflict. Most often the most effective solution is to do an end run around the problem. So it's not you saying this is what the library needs, even though you know that's what it needs, but it's your community, your patrons, your voters, whoever people are accountable, coming and saying this is what the library needs. So.
Yeah, obviously The most important thing is getting those advocates for you out in the community. Obviously, you're going to be expected to advocate for yourselves. But a lot of times when you're approaching and getting into a situation with people that hold power or people that are standing against you, they just look at you and say, well, that's what you're supposed to do. But if you have advocates outside come in and start talking to them, that makes your case that much stronger. It's not just you advocating for a change or advocating for more money or advocating for whatever. There's now another group, whether it be parents, the PTA, faculty if you're in a university situation, upstanding leaders of the community, now talking to those people in power saying, hey, you know, this is a good idea or this is a good thing. Don't eliminate it, fund it, whatever the case may be. It happened to us. Our mayor, when we went to referendum recently, was against us. But we had enough people in the community speak up, write to the newspapers, and counteract what he was saying that we passed the referendum. And since then, people have been talking to him, and he's come back around, and now he is not a huge supporter of the library, but he's, I would say, a lukewarm supporter. He doesn't stand in our way for when we want to do things.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is it's the myth of the external expert. Like, obviously, if you're within the organization, you're too involved, so you can't possibly know what's best for the organization because you're blinded by your perspective, which is wrong. Most of the time, people in the organization actually do have the knowledge to do it. But that's why companies hire outside consultants, is because they need somebody outside of the organization to validate the knowledge inside the organization. So what most consultants do, they interview the people in the organization and then tell the bosses what the people in the organization already know, right? And getting that kind of external advocacy group is really important. So just having somebody outside the library coming in and supporting you is very important. In addition, if that group is made up of people who, for example, a politician is accountable to voters, so if it's made out of voters, that's important. Schools are accountable to voters and to parents, right? So again, that's a group of people who are particularly important. In city council meetings, certain groups of business leaders tend to have an immense influence. And if you can get those business leaders to at least be sympathetic to the library, so that they're not standing in the way of what's going on, that's a huge win, right? You don't need to have the perfect situation, you just need to make sure that they are not getting in your way, and when it comes to issues of money, that you have a solid group of people supporting you, okay? Because remember, the parents, the voters, so on and so forth, who come out are also the people who are going to be making decisions, such as when a millage decision is on the ballot, or when, you know, library funding, an expansion project is on the ballot, so on and so forth. So if you've already got a community that's committed to the library, first, they'll vote for you, and second, you can convince them it's important enough for them to actually turn out their friends and neighbors to vote. So that's important. So any questions about all of this? The take-home lesson is that sometimes it's about argument, and sometimes it's about showing what the right thing is, but sometimes it's really just about certain people who are trying to use their power. And in that case, you have to be prepared to basically use the leverage you have to overcome their power. Yep.
So an interesting thing that's unfolding in Evanston is that we have a community organization, the YMCA, that is getting funding by a foundation in town to start like their own makerspace and workshop and so on and so forth. But yet we have this great public library, you know, that has been working in that way. And it just feels like, you know, if I step outside and I just think of myself as a taxpayer or someone in the community, it's like, why are we double dip, like, why are we not coming together as a whole? And, you know, I mean, I think as a librarian, when I'm wearing that hat, I think of, you know, why were we not the first point of place to go to be part of that conversation and maybe lay it out how that would look. And so I'm wondering from your perspective, if you can offer any, based on that this is already in the movement, that they're gonna do this, they got X, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this through the Y, is it something where we show up and say, you know, we would like to be the partner in this, or this is how we see ourselves integrating into this great thing that you're doing instead of this separate entity sort of thing?
Yeah.
On
So,
some level, I mean, we can't take it all on, but.
I mean, I think this is actually a good example of community outreach, which it doesn't involve, like, you know, the kind of authority of City Hall or whatever. In this kind of case, the answer depends on who the people are who are getting this funding through the other organization, right? And without knowing anything, I can't tell you anything about that. But as far as the strategy, my first strategy in that situation is set up a meeting and talk, because most people in organizations like this who are kind of going for tech entrepreneurship, who are doing makerspace stuff, they have a big tent philosophy, right? They want as many people to get involved as possible. They want the ideas to spread. They're often somewhat missionary in their approach, like they want to spread the word, right? And if you're like, yeah, I want to do this with you, most of the time their response is, awesome, let's figure out how to do this, because it's validating for them to have somebody else say, yes, this is important, yes, this is interesting, yes, you know, we can do this. And you know, I know in Champaign what was going on with the makerspace is that I believe there are now kind of 3 locations where makerspace activity happens. One is at the University of Illinois, where they got some kind of fancy special grant to create their own kind of makerspace. One is at the Independent Media Center, which is a different group of people who wanted to do their own kind of makerspace stuff, and they have different kind of focuses. And then one is at I think it's Urbana Public Library, where the university group basically said, we want to do this in a way that gives access to more people, and most people in the community don't come to the university campus. And the university is also kind of grumpy about people coming to the campus. So we're going to partner with the library to try to get this to work. But what has happened is that all the groups kind of respect the different things they're doing. They've ended up having a different focus from one another, and they're working together. So they don't see each other as being competitors. They see each other as being mutually supportive kind of individual things. Whereas like the Independent Media Center focuses more on like physical crafts and sewing and other kinds of technologies like that. The university tends to be more on computing, but they share resources, share knowledge, so that they're not both reinventing. And so they see it as a synergy. And if you position yourself as part of that, you know, you can make, even if you're somewhat separate in how you do things, you can make it look like it is one effort with multiple locations, right? And fit your library in that way.
Well, and I just feel like it's so important in terms of educating this other part of the community that like, oh yeah, we've got, you know, 15 school libraries, we've got 3 public entities in town, we've got all of this wealth. And in moving information and resource, that's really powerful in hitting these different parts of our city.
Well, we partner with our park district quite extensively. At one time, we were adversaries. We were offering programs for free that they were charging for, and then finally, leadership was shook up on both ends, and we came together in dialogue. And now we offer free library programs for them at their facilities because their facilities can handle a larger crowd than our facility can. And in exchange, they publicize some of our events for us. We publicize their events, some of their events they want. They send teachers over to us, so we can offer like sample classes for free of Park District programs that have to be paid for. But we've got this now working back and forth partnership in the community that is very beneficial to both of us. You know, we hit their patrons or the people that they come to their facilities, and then vice versa, they're picking up people that come to our facilities as
Any other questions? Okay. So let's actually get started and do this a little bit. So